Chapter 9. Maigret took his time. His glass in his hand, he was looking at the professor's face, while the professor, for his part, looked at him calmly. "The concierge also owes you a debt of gratitude, doesn't she? If I'm not mistaken, you saved her son. I don't expect gratitude from anyone. Nevertheless, she's devoted to you, and like Lucille Decaux, would be ready to lie to get you out of an awkward situation. Of course, it's always pleasant to think of one's being heroic. Don't you feel alone sometimes, in the world as you see it? All human beings are alone, whatever they think. You just have to admit it and adjust to it. I thought you hated solitude. That's not the kind of solitude I meant. Let's say, if you prefer, that what distresses me is emptiness. I don't like to be alone in the apartment, or in the street, or in a car. It's about physical solitude rather than moral isolation. Are you afraid of death? I don't care about being dead. I hate death itself, with all it entails. In your profession, Inspector, you've seen it almost as often as I have. He knew perfectly well that this was his weak point, that this fear of dying alone was the little touch of human cowardice that made him, in spite of everything, a man like any other. He wasn't ashamed of it. Since my last heart attack, I've almost always had someone with me. Medically, it wouldn't be any help. Nevertheless, strange as it may seem, any presence reassures me. Once, when I was alone in the city and I felt faint, I went into the first bar I came across. This was the moment that Maigret chose to ask the question he had been keeping in reserve for a long time. What was your reaction when you realized that Louise was pregnant? He seemed surprised, not that the subject should be brought up, but that it should be considered a possible problem. I didn't have any reaction, he said simply. Didn't she tell you? No, I assume she didn't yet know. She found out at about 6 o'clock on Monday. You saw her after that. Didn't she say anything? Only that she wasn't feeling well and was going to bed. Did you think the child was yours? I didn't think any such thing. Have you ever had children? Not as far as I know. Have you ever wanted to? His reply shocked Maigret. For 30 years now, his greatest regret had been that he wasn't a father. Why should I? The professor asked. Precisely. What do you mean? Nothing. Some people who have no serious interests in life imagine that a child makes them important, useful in some way, makes them feel they'll be leaving something behind them. I'm not one of those people. Don't you think that given your age and her boyfriend's, Lulu would have assumed the child was his? There's no scientific basis for that. I'm talking about what she may have thought. It's possible. Wasn't that sufficient to make up her mind to leave you for Pierrot? He did not hesitate. No, he replied, still like a man who is sure he possesses the truth. She would surely have told me the child was mine. Would you have recognized the child as your own? Why not? Even if you had doubts that you were the father? What difference does that make? One child is as good as any other. Would you have married the mother? I don't see why I should. Don't you think she would have tried to get you to marry her? If she had, she wouldn't have succeeded. Because you don't want to leave your wife? Simply because I find these complications ridiculous. I'm answering you frankly because I think you're able to understand me. Did you talk about it with your wife? On Sunday afternoon, if I remember correctly. Yes, it was Sunday. I spent part of the afternoon at home. Why did you tell her? I told my assistant, too. I know. And? He was right to think that Maigret understood. There was something terribly arrogant and at the same time tragic in the way the professor spoke about those around him, especially the women. He took them all at face value without the slightest illusion, asking of each only what she could give him. It was as if, to him, they were not much more than inanimate objects. Nor did he take the trouble to keep silent in front of them. What would have been the point? He could think aloud without worrying how they might react, let alone what they might be thinking or feeling. What did your wife say? She asked me what I was planning to do. Did you tell her you would recognize the child? He nodded. Didn't it occur to you this might upset her? Perhaps. This time, Maigret suspected something in the other man that hadn't come through so far, or that he hadn't been able to spot. There was a secret satisfaction in the professor's voice as he said, "Perhaps." "So you did it deliberately," he said sharply. "Telling her, you mean?" Maigret was sure that Gouin would have preferred not to smile, to remain impassive, but he couldn't help it, and for the first time his lips curled strangely. In other words, you were quite content to upset your wife and your assistant. The way Gouin kept silent constituted an admission. Mightn't one or other of them have got it into their heads to get rid of Louise Fillon? It's an idea they must both have been fairly familiar with for a long time. They both hated Louise. I don't know anyone who hasn't wished for the death of another human being at some time or other. Only people capable of putting their idea into practice are rare. Fortunately for you. It was all true, which was what made this conversation so incredible. What the professor had said from the start was, when it came down to it, what Maigret himself thought. Their ideas about men and their motives weren't so different. What was different was their attitude to the problem. Gouin only used what Maigret would have called his cold reason, whereas Maigret tried to... He would have been hard put to define what it was he tried to do. Perhaps understanding people gave him a feeling that wasn't just pity, but a kind of affection. Gouin looked at them from a great height. Maigret put himself on the same level as them. Louise Fillon was murdered, he said slowly. That's a fact. Someone went all the way. Have you wondered who? That's your job, not mine. Did it occur to you we might think it was you? Of course. At that time I didn't yet know that my wife had spoken to you, and I was surprised you didn't come and question me. The concierge told me you knew about me. She too. And Gouin accepted it as his due. You went to Cochin on Monday night, but you only stayed half an hour at your patient's bedside. I went up to sleep in a room on the 4th floor that's kept at my disposal. You were alone there, and there was nothing to stop you leaving the hospital without being seen, coming here by taxi and then going back to your room. At what time, according to you, did these comings and goings take place? It would have had to be between 9 and 11. At what time was Pierre Hérault in Louise's apartment? At 9:45. So I would have had to kill Louise after that. Maigret nodded. Given the time it would have taken me to make the journey, I wouldn't have been back at the hospital between 10 and past. Maigret calculated mentally. The professor's argument was logical, and suddenly Maigret looked disappointed. Something wasn't happening as he'd foreseen. He was expecting what was to come, barely listening to what his interlocutor was telling him. It so happens, Monsieur Maigret, that at 10:05, a colleague of mine, Dr. Lanvin, who had just examined a patient on the 3rd floor, came upstairs to see me. He didn't trust his own diagnosis and asked me if I could come with him. I went down to the 3rd floor. Neither my assistant nor the staff in my department could have told you that, because they didn't know. This isn't the testimony of a woman anxious to get me out of trouble, but of 5 or 6 people, including the patient, who'd never seen me before and probably doesn't even know my name. I've never thought you killed Lulu. He deliberately called her by that name, which appeared to displease the professor. Maigret too had a desire to be cruel. I'd simply expected you to try to cover for the person who did kill her. Gouin took this in. A slight flush appeared on his cheeks, and for a moment he turned his eyes away from Maigret. The doorbell rang. It was Lucas. The maid admitted him. He had a little package in his hand. No prints, he said, unwrapping the gun and handing it to his chief. He looked at both of them, surprised at the prevailing calm, surprised also to find them in exactly the same places, in the same poses, as if while he'd been running about the city, time here had stood still. This is your gun, isn't it, Monsieur Gouin? It was a fancy weapon with a nickel-plated barrel and a mother-of-pearl grip. If the shot hadn't been fired at close range, it probably would not have done much harm. There's a bullet missing from the magazine, Lucas said. I phoned Gaston Renette. He'll do the usual tests tomorrow, but for now, he's convinced that this is the gun that was used on Monday. I assume, Monsieur Gouin, that both your wife and your assistant had access to your desk drawer. It wasn't locked? I never lock anything. That, too, was a kind of contempt for people. He had nothing to hide. He didn't care if anyone read his personal papers. You weren't surprised when you came home on Monday night to find your sister-in-law in the apartment? She usually avoids me. I think she hates you, doesn't she? It's another way to make her life interesting. Your wife told me her sister just happened to drop by because she was in the neighborhood. It's possible. But when I questioned Antoinette, she told me her sister had phoned her. and asked her to come over. Gouin was listening attentively, but it was impossible to detect any particular expression on his face. Sitting back in his armchair, his legs crossed, he kept his fingers together, and Maigret was struck by the length of those fingers, as slender as a pianist's. "Sit down, Luca. Would you like me to ask for a drink for your inspector?" Luca refused with a gesture. "There's another thing your wife stated that I need to check, and I can only do so through you." The professor gave a sign that he was waiting. "She said that some time ago you had a blackout while you were in Lulu's apartment. That's true. A little exaggerated, but true. Is it also correct that your mistress called your wife in a panic?" Gouin seemed surprised. "Who told you that?" "Never mind. Is it the truth?" "Not completely. You do realize your answer is of great importance." "I realize it from the way you're asking the question, but I have no idea why. One night I didn't feel well. I asked Louise to come up here and fetch a flask of medicine, which was in my bathroom. She did so. My wife opened the door to her because the servants were in bed and their rooms are on the 6th floor. My wife, who was also in bed when Louise arrived, went to look for the flask." "Did they go down together?" "Yes. Only in the meantime the attack had passed, and I'd already left the downstairs apartment. In fact, I was just coming through the door when Louise and my wife appeared, both in their nightdresses." "Will you excuse me for a moment?" Maigret said a few words in a low voice to Luca, who left the room. Gouin didn't ask any questions, didn't appear surprised. "Was the door wide open behind you?" "It was slightly ajar." Maigret would have preferred him to lie. For an hour now he'd been hoping that Gouin would try to lie, but he was relentlessly honest. "Are you sure?" He was giving him a last chance. "Absolutely. As far as you know, has your wife ever been to see Lulu in the apartment on the 3rd floor?" "You don't know her." Hadn't Germaine Gouin asserted that it was the only opportunity she'd had to see the inside of the apartment? The fact was, she hadn't gone inside that night, yet when she had come downstairs to meet Maigret, she hadn't looked around her with any curiosity, but had acted as if the place was familiar to her. It was her second lie, added to which was the fact that she hadn't mentioned that Lulu was pregnant. "Do you think she's still listening at the door?" It was a pointless precaution on his part to have sent Luca to take up position at the entrance to the apartment. "I'm convinced of it," the professor began. And indeed, the communicating door now opened. Madame Gouin took 2 steps forward, just enough to be able to look her husband in the face, and never before had Maigret seen so much hate and contempt in human eyes. The professor did not turn away, but absorbed the shock without flinching. As for Maigret, he stood up. "I'm obliged to arrest you, Madame Gouin." "I know," she said, almost absently, still turned towards her husband. "I assume you heard everything." "Yes." "Do you admit you killed Louise Fillon?" She nodded, and it looked for a moment as if she were about to throw herself like a fury at the professor, who still sustained her gaze. "He knew it would happen," she said at last in a staccato voice, while her chest rose and fell rapidly. "I wonder now if it wasn't what he wanted, if he didn't confide certain things to me, knowingly, to drive me to it." "Did you call your sister to give yourself an alibi?" She nodded again. "I assume you went downstairs when you left the boudoir on the pretext of making toddies," Maigret went on. He saw her frown, and her gaze turned away from Gouin and came to rest on Maigret. She seemed to hesitate. You sensed there was a struggle in her. At last, in a curt voice, she said, "It isn't true." "What isn't true?" "But my sister stayed on her own." As Gouin looked at him with an ironic glint in his eyes, Maigret turned red, because that look clearly meant, "What did I tell you?" It was true. Germaine was refusing to bear the weight of the crime alone. She could have just kept silent, but she had to speak out. "Antoinette knew what I was going to do. My courage failed me at the last moment, so she went down with me." "Did she go in?" "She stayed on the stairs." And after a silence, as if defying all of them, "Too bad. It's the truth." Her lips were trembling with contained rage. "Now he'll be able to renew his harem." Madame Gouin was wrong. There was little change in the professor's life. It was not until a few months later that Lucille Decaux moved in with him while continuing to be his assistant and secretary. Did she try to get him to marry her? Maigret had no idea. In any case, the professor did not remarry, and whenever his name came up in conversation, Maigret pretended not to hear, or hastened to talk about something else. This has been an Audible Studios production of Maigret's Mistake, written by Georges Simenon, performed by Gareth Armstrong. Production copyright 2017 by Audible Limited. Audible Studios is a division of Audible Limited.
Audible hopes you've enjoyed this program.